Dr. Daniel Kinka is American Prairie Reserve's Wildlife Restoration Manager, and his primary responsibilities include restoring and monitoring wildlife on the reserve and managing the wildlife-friendly ranching program called Wild Sky. He joined the American Prairie in 2018, shortly after completing his doctoral degree in ecology at Utah State University. Daniel's originally from Florida and the Washington, D.C. area, and he's enjoyed living out west since 2010. And he's got a deep passion for science communication, having worked as a science reporter for Utah Public Radio, publishing in High Country News, and serving as a National Geographic Society Fellow. So at this time, I'll welcome Daniel.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Chad, and thanks for having me, everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you tonight. I think what we'll do is I've got a presentation prepared for you guys, as you know. I'll go ahead and I'll share that, and I think the easiest would be if we just hold questions till the end. Normally, I would say just jump in at any time, but the way with the mechanics of doing the Zoom share and through Microsoft Teams just makes it a little clunky. So if you've got good thoughts or ideas, write them down, and then we'll do maybe kind of an open floor Q&A at the end. So yeah, so American Prairie Reserve. What is that? Why are we talking to you guys? Some of you might have seen the videos, and others of you might be waiting for those. But let me just go over what we do. So our mission at APR is to create the largest nature reserve in the continental United States, a refuge for people and wildlife preserved forever as part of America's heritage. And I'll come back to that, but it kind of begs the question, why? Why do something like that? Well, there's a lot of different answers to that question why, but I'm the wildlife restoration guy at APR, and so I tend to think about wildlife, right? When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I'm going to tell you the APR story, the American Prairie Reserve story, but very much from the perspective of wildlife. Being the Wildlife Federation, I figure this is something that you guys can that will resonate with y'all. So going into the why, well, temperate grasslands, or prairies being synonymous for that, are basically the least protected biome on the planet right now, with less than 5% protection globally. Protection being some kind of park or national forest, something set aside to prevent it from development, overuse problems with grazing, farming, things like that. They turn out to be the least protected biome on the planet. In fact, a recent IUCN study, well, not so recent anymore, prior to the existence of the American Prairie Reserve, so about 20 years ago, actually determined that of all of the grasslands globally, there's really only 4 that are still large enough and intact enough to even warrant serious considerations for protections at an ecosystem level, right? All the other grasslands in the world, besides the 4 that you see on the screen right now, are so fragmented or destabilized that it looks impractical to do ecosystem-wide restoration. So we just have 4 that are available to us to even really consider for ecosystem-level protections, one of which being the Northern Great Plains, which is where I'm speaking from with you from tonight. So let's zoom in on that a little bit. This is American Prairie Reserve in the context of the continental United States, right there in kind of north-central Montana. And what is this land other than this kind of like weird amoeba on the map that you see before you? Well, we know from oral tradition and archaeological record and anthropological record that this grass plains was for about the last 13,000 years, so since the last major ice age, since the end of the Pleistocene, has been a place with large diversities of grassland grazing mammals and human inhabitants for about 12 or 13,000 years as well. People who were existing primarily nomadically because of due to the nature of the fact that these wildlife were migratory, and the best way to make a go out of it as a human being was to be migratory and follow these herds around as a means of subsistence. This picture here shows a Native American guy on a horse. Horses didn't come back to didn't find their way back to North America until about the 1700s. So this would be a snapshot of kind of late in that period, or even the end of that kind of the most recent image of a kind of a pre-colonial North America. In fact, this image persists even into the colonial period. So Lewis and Clark made it to our part of the Missouri River in 1801, and they described a very similar scene, an area just absolutely teeming with wildlife, a kind of an American Serengeti, a place just absolutely brimming, particularly with large ungulates or large grazing animals, but with their companion predators as well. This is an image called When the Land Belonged to God that was painted by Charlie Russell, the famous Western painter Charlie Russell, who's the namesake of the wildlife refuge that we kind of surround at APR. And this, I think, is a good indication of what the land might have looked like at the time of Lewis and Clark and for the few hundred years preceding their arrival as well. And early on, this was recognized even by the colonists as something that was worth preserving. In 1841, you have the famous American painter George Catlin calling for the creation of a nation's park around these grasslands, not based around, you know, geysers and glaciers and canyons and kind of those geophysical features that we kind of created the Park Service around much later, but originally around this wildlife menagerie that existed in the center of the continent. It was that extraordinary. And so you have these calls for a park very, very early on, about 50 years before the kind of anybody's thinking about creating a national park service. But of course, those cries went unanswered. And what you get from about 1840, 1850 for about the next 50 to 100 years is, in a very, very short amount of time, the kind of wholesale collapse of this ecosystem. And it's a sad story that has a lot of different socio-political, economic factors involved with it. Everything from the Indian wars in the plains, the nomadic peoples of the United States were some of the last indigenous peoples to be subjugated. And part of that was because of due to their nomadic way of lifestyle. But when eventually, just getting pop-up notifications, but eventually, as a way to subjugate the peoples that were living in the region, bison became a target of war as well. And so you see the kind of wholesale slaughter of the bison, the U.S. Army recognizing this as the primary food source and the primary source of all resources for these plains tribes, and knowing that the best way to subjugate these peoples were to remove the bison entirely. But that's not the only thing that removes bison, right? Like commodity, open markets for things like bison hides, bison pelt, bison leather also drive this animal to darn close to extinction, only to the point where we have like 30 or 40 persisting in what is today Yellowstone Park. Other than that, if not for them, the plains bison would have gone extinct entirely. All the bison that exist today, plains bison, are the descendants of these 40 or so animals from Yellowstone. We also have things like the fur trade that's going on during this period that is kind of denuding the rivers in particular of things like beaver and muskrat and otters, and then pursuit of fashion. That's what this picture of these guys with their beaver skin hats is all about. Later in the period, so kind of around the turn of the century, you start to see, the turn of the 20th century, you start to see the land being tilled up as people start to kind of attempt to turn it into farm ground, only to find out that these kind of arid highland shortgrass prairies don't make very productive farm ground at all. They're just far too dry, which instigates a kind of Dust Bowl effect, which actually hits Montana about a decade earlier than the Southwest. You have things like damming of the Missouri River, which creates the Fort Peck Reservoir, as well as hundreds, if not thousands, of other smaller dams that impound water throughout the prairie and impact our natural hydrological system, which throws things kind of screwy. And then, of course, the open range cattle days shortly after the bison were nearly eradicated, which led to a lot of concerns about overgrazing, coupled with those farming attempts. Like I said, drove the Dust Bowl to Montana about a decade earlier than the more southern parts of the country. So it's not a very happy story. But the remnant of that, flash forward to today, or at least 20 years ago, prior to the creation of American Prairie Reserve, what you see is a landscape that is largely intact. I'll show that map again so you can kind of get your bearings. But I talked about farming, and the prairie is still being tilled up at an alarming rate. But the area in which we work is one of the least tilled places, least tilled parts of the prairie. So what you get is our vegetative community remains largely intact. Yes, we have some non-native weed species and things that we have to cope with, but by and large, the prairie, the foundation of the ecosystem itself, remains fairly intact. But what's above it, the kind of animal diversity that would have existed on the plains, has been largely removed. None of these species are completely extinct, except for the Rocky Mountain locust, which we think is gone. All of these animals still exist somewhere in the continent. They either exist completely outside of the Prairie Reserve region, or they exist at very, very low abundance in the Prairie Reserve area. And so our issue is not so much a question of biodiversity in the sense of species loss. It's an issue of biodiversity in the sense of lack of abundance for this wildlife. But you have that same canvas, that foundation upon which that ecosystem could be rebuilt. And I'll talk more about that as the talk goes on. So again, we have originally, as recently as the 1880s, really, this vision of a kind of a wild American continent that rivals the Serengeti in terms of a grassland ecosystem with its large-bodied grazers and their commensurate predators. And today you have basically that canvas, but with the wildlife removed. Very little human population, potentially less human population now than there would have been even in the 1800s when Lewis and Clark first saw this place. Some road development, quite a bit of fence development, but otherwise pretty empty landscape. And then, of course, what's not pictured here is hundreds of thousands of domestic livestock, primarily cattle. And this loss of wildlife in central Montana is indicative of losses of wildlife, vertebrate wildlife, at a global scale. This report came out just last year, but in the last 50 years, so since just 1970, we've seen a 2/3 loss of vertebrate wildlife across the entire globe. These numbers are, of course, global, but we see the same patterns are reflected in just our backyard where we work as well. If we look at just mammals, another way of kind of picturing that loss of biodiversity or kind of a bioabundance is to say that in 1850, so around the time that things start to go topsy-turvy in central Montana, humans and livestock globally made up just 15% of all mammal life by mass, right? If you put everything on a scale, people and their livestock were only 15% of that total number. By 2018, humans and livestock made up 94% of the complete mass of mammals on the planet, with wild mammals adding up to only the remaining 6%. That's 6% for literally every other mammalian species besides a human and a cow and a pig and a goat, basically. Every blue whale, every giraffe, every bison, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that trend continues with projections for 2030 looking more like it's going to be 97% humans and livestock, with just the remaining 3% for mammals. So the trends are bleak, and what we see in our own backyard is indicative of the world as a whole. And if we kind of ask, well, what's contributing to this? I think we all kind of know the answer, but I'll go back to this slide again, particularly when we were talking about grasslands. These are areas where human beings like to live. More specifically, they're areas where humans like to make food. In the wetter areas of grasslands tend to make very good farming land, and the drier areas are typically globally set aside for grazing, but grazing of domestic livestock. So specifically because this is such quote unquote useful land for humans, we didn't protect very much of it, but you also see the driving off of most of this large mammalian wildlife off of the plains and replaced by domestic livestock. So what I want to do next is actually just kind of look at this from a slightly different angle and kind of walk you through, at least for the mammal, this is kind of the large mammal community that would exist in our region, right? Medium to large bodied mammals. In 1800, remember Lewis and Clark show up in 1801, and there's some French fur trappers besides that, but these are basically the first white people to make it to the interior of the continent. And so what they're seeing is this vision of kind of still a very wild North America. Potentially smaller Native American populations because European diseases beat us across the continent, but it's debated. What we know was there is this community of mammals. If we fast forward to 1885, which is kind of the beginning of real significant declines in that wildlife population, we notice that the grizzly bear has been completely driven off of the plains, which is where grizzly bears evolved in the first place. Most people associate them with mountains or mountain parks like Yellowstone or Glacier. It's really a plains species that evolved on the open prairies. We just only find them in mountains now because it's the only place where they're allowed to exist. We see the vanishing of the grizzly bear, the bison being driven almost to extinction, and then beaver being nearly trapped completely out of the region. Although with the exception of those three species, we see more or less, we think that the mammal community would have been more or less intact. From 1885 to 1925, you see the loss of significant chunks of the rest of the wildlife species that are there. Now, all of our large carnivore species have been persecuted out of existence in the region. We've also lost the little fox that you see disappear there. The swift fox is the kind of endemic fox of the prairie. It too is gone now, not due to targeted removal, but just as bycatch with people trying to persecute and remove wolves and coyotes. This little swift fox gets trapped out, killed out as well. Most of the large ungulate population is driven to near extinction or near extirpation. This often gets attributed to just subsistence hunting by the people that lived in the region, and certainly it wasn't easy to make a living in the prairies those days, and a lot of this wildlife was killed in kind of a tragedy of the commons, with people just hunting them for subsistence. But quite a bit of it was out of persecution because they're perceived to compete with domestic livestock as well. And so you see all of the large ungulates starting to either completely disappear or drop down to almost nothingness. That problem continues into about the 1950s, where from 1950s on, we see more or less this picture of wildlife till about 2000, till APR shows up, right? And so now the difference between 1925 and 1950 being people figured out how to do really wholesale removal of prairie dogs. Again, an ecosystem engineer, an incredibly important species in our ecosystem, but often viewed as a competitor for livestock because they're an herbivore as well. So they're driven never completely to extirpation, but prairie dogs occupy about 2% of their historic range today compared to what they would have been the case in the 1800s. And the black-footed ferret, that animal that you see there, is now completely gone as well. Black-footed ferrets eat almost only nothing but prairie dogs. So this is a species that's completely dependent, has specialized on prairie dogs. In a world with shrinking prairie dog populations, you just can't have black-footed ferrets, which is why today they are probably the most endangered mammal in all of North America. And that continues till about the time that APR shows up and starts working. So this system, and mule deer make a rebound, which is kind of a complicated story, but we see a little bit of a recovery from some of these ungulates. Elk are reintroduced later in the century. There's other wildlife recovery, but essentially this is more or less the picture until the early 2000s. That kind of story that I just shared with you about what's going on with wildlife in central Montana, we can look at that another way and look at range contractions of a couple different species across their entire ranges, not just in central Montana. And so another way of looking at this between the kind of historic range and the current range of a number of select species that I picked out here, bison, again, are all but driven to extinction. They occupy, even today, after massive recovery efforts, just an itsy-bitsy fraction of their original historic range. Black-footed ferrets, as I mentioned, were actually believed to be completely extinct until the mid-80s, when 13 were found in central Wyoming, which became the founders for every living ferret today. Grizzly bears are doing a little bit better, but again, we have a plains bear that has been driven completely into the northern Rocky Mountains in terms of habitat. Sage grouse are losing habitat at an alarming rate, but they're still occupying something like 15% of their historic range. You see swift fox there as well. Swift fox fare a little bit better. This is a fox that basically eats insects, does a little bit of egg eating, so are not generally persecuted directly because they don't compete with livestock producers, but oftentimes are killed off just on accident as bycatch. And so they're gone from the American Prairie Reserve region, but doing okay in other parts of the historic region. And then pronghorn habitat becomes patchier and patchier as basically more and more fences go up and you contribute to habitat fragmentation, which the pronghorn, having evolved on the open prairies, just have very, very little ability to deal with these kind of linear impediments to their migration. Now what I want to talk about is, I mean, there's a way we can think about this as just kind of species loss or just numbers going down, right? Just kind of turning the knob down on all the wildlife. But thinking more ecologically, there's something else going on here. It's not a simple, plus minus type of equation. When we lose indigenous native wildlife, even if you're replacing those with something that seems to be synonymous from an ecosystem perspective, right? In this case, cattle replacing this says native ungulates, but we're basically telling the story of bison here, right? We can see as the bison populations go down, the cattle population goes up in the region. It's almost a perfect correlation, right? And as there's fewer and fewer bison, that means you can have more and more cattle. But I'd like to talk about how those animals are not, a domestic cow is not a perfect surrogate for a bison. So even if you're thinking, oh, this is a nutrient transfer thing, the grasslands continue to be have a lot of high primary productivity. You have a lot of grasses converting sunlight energy into food energy for grazing herbivores. What's the difference? You know, we still have kind of intact nutrient chains. Well, there's more going on than just that kind of nutrient cycle or this food web that we usually talk about. And that's where we get into things like ecosystem engineering, ecosystem services, and then also this idea of an ecosystem engineer, the bison being kind of our primary example of that, but beaver and prairie dogs getting notable mentions as well. So what makes a cow different from a bison? Well, one, there's a number of things. Even though they have broadly overlapping diets, bison are far, far more drought adapted than the domestic European descendant cattle that we primarily use today, which are far more, have higher requirements for water. And what that equates to on the landscape is bison, if left to their own devices, will graze quite a ways away from a water source. In this one study that was actually conducted at American Prairie Reserve, we found that bison were grazing up to 3.8 miles, about 4 miles away from a water source. And what's interesting is the pastures that our bison are on didn't allow them to really get any farther from water source than about 4 miles. So it might actually be bigger than that. This is just the most that we were able to test based on where our fences were. Compared to cattle that are just on our neighboring pastures, cattle very, very rarely go more than about a half a mile from water if left to their own devices. Anybody that's been around cattle production knows this, right? You got to have a water source in every single pasture or paddock, right? In order to spread out grazing distribution. Domestic cows are just not good. They stick to water and can be very damaging on these kind of riparian or aquatic habitats as a result, which bison don't do, because they'll graze quite a bit farther away and just visit water to drink and then kind of go back out into the dry uplands. But I think what that contributes to, and this story gets into other things that I won't go into as much, things like fire effects, what we call pyrrhic herbivory, so the interaction of wildfire and large-bodied grazers. But right now we'll just talk about bison, and we'll talk about kind of functional or structural diversity of the prairie itself, right? And so if you think about a prairie as just a composition of plant species, you can see it as being kind of homogeneous everywhere, right? But if you add to that fire and grazing effects, we can see that the structure of the grasslands itself, even though most of these plants aren't growing more than 12 or 18 inches above the ground, the structure can vary considerably based on how wild grazing and fire interact with that. And so what we think was happening, we don't really know for sure because there's nobody around to study, or modern science didn't exist when the bison was driven to near extinction. But compared to cattle, which have for a long time been based around this idea of kind of a take half, leave half grazing method, right? If you're a cattle producer, best management practices this is changing a little bit, but the best management practice for a very long time was, if I will graze so that my cattle eat half of the available forage, and then the other half of that's made available in a given year from green up will go to wildlife, right? And so if you think about the prairie as kind of a lawn, and this is, the entire interior of the continent, right? Because we're using domestic cattle as a managed grazing tool, we get a very homogeneous prairie, one that is grazed kind of like evenly. I guess I'm doing my slides backwards here. Let me start this other way. Let's go this way. So if we just kind of cut down in the middle of the graph, right? And so what domestic cattle are doing is just managing for an evenly 50-50 grazed prairie, which leads to a kind of homogeneity on the prairie, right? Whereas we think what bison would have done is, because they're wild and they had these gigantic migration patterns, they would be grazing through an area, perhaps, once very, very intensely in a given year. I mean, grazing things down to nothing, taking almost 100% of the available forage before moving on, but then not revisit that same patch for years in some cases. And so the combination of that, along with all of the other grazing herbivores, plus wildfires that are regularly burning across the prairie leads to a kind of a heterogeneous, or like a mosaic Apache landscape of grasslands, right? Again, more or less the same species composition of the grassland, but structural diversity. Some are bare ground, some are managed at that kind of like medium grazing level, and some don't get grazed for years on end. And that habitat diversity, that structural diversity, drives biodiversity. And so birds, grassland songbirds, are the classic example of this, right? Where we see, and that's what this graph is. I'm finally getting to the graph here, right? We can see the home ranges are the kind of the preferred structural habitat for just a handful of different kind of endemic grassland bird species, right? And what we see is you've got things like mountain plovers that rely on almost bare ground, ferruginous hawks that are also very tightly tied to that same habitat. This is mostly because ferruginous hawks eat a lot of prairie dogs, and prairie dogs maintain that kind of bare, almost ground cover. And on the other side, cassin sparrows don't exist in my region, but you look at something like the Baird sparrow or the Sprig's pipit, which are two of the most imperiled grassland bird species right now. They rely on this kind of like shrubbier, ungrazed pastures as nesting and breeding areas in particular. And so again, moving away from that kind of wild cattle, fire, prairie dog grazing regime to just domestic cattle managed very, very tightly and homogeneously in this take half, leave half model, you only leave this very narrow window of structural habitat to try and satisfy the very diverse needs of all these grassland birds, and it just doesn't work. So if we look in the middle of the group there, what we find is something like the lark bunting, or a meadow lark is not pictured here, but would be another good example, is doing very, very well. These great grassland songbirds like that, like medium grazing, and that's everywhere throughout the Midwest. And so they're doing okay, climate change notwithstanding, the habitat exists. Things like mountain plovers and McCown's longspurs or Baird sparrows and Sprig's pipits are doing terribly because across the entire continent, there's very, very, very little habitat left for them to occupy. Again, if we're thinking about the structure of the grassland habitat. This is this idea of an ecosystem engineer, and it's just one example of it, right? The classical example of an ecosystem engineer is a beaver, right? Because it's a very easy thing to get your head around, right? Like a beaver takes a free-flowing stream, it dams it, it creates a pond. The beaver does this for out of its own needs and desires as a species, but in turn, it's creating a pond, stillwater habitat, where before there was none, which supports much higher levels of biodiversity, because now in that same general area, you have a moving stream, but you also have this beaver pond, and therefore you can support more biodiversity, more different species richness, because you have an animal that's creating different habitats. The bison do this in the same way through this kind of grazing regime that they do, and then prairie dogs as well, in addition to digging holes and creating subterranean habitat for a number of other species as well. So this is what we lose when we go from something like bison to cattle. This is something that I mentioned that kind of modern grazing practice. Grazing is starting to catch up. I don't want to put too much blame on who are literally my neighbors, cattle ranchers, right? Like there is a lot of push in the kind of more progressive sectors of cattle ranching to think about how can we make cows look more like bison? How can we manage our cows to graze in such a way that mimics this heterogeneity on the plains and not that homogeneity? And people are coming up with good ideas. But even still, it's not a perfect replacement, right? Again, my job here tonight is not to vilify cattle. I like hamburgers as much as there is something functionally lost when you replace, these wild species with domestic ones. And one example of this that we're only just starting to understand now is bison do this thing called wallowing. They probably do it for a number of reasons that are poorly understood. Everything from dealing with kind of ectoparasites, so just getting flies and ticks and things off of them. The males do this quite a bit during the breeding season. They'll actually urinate in these wallows and then roll around in it to make themselves stinky and appear larger in hopes to attract a mate. It might have a cooling effect if there's mud there as well during the hot days of the prairie. So there's a number of reasons that they would do this. But the point is, cattle don't do this. And you can't make a domestic cow wallow. It's just not something that they do, whereas bison do it freely. And what we're just starting to learn, the picture on the left there, on the top left, is an old historic picture of a wallow in, I think, Kansas. And this is long after bison have been extirpated from the region. So these things actually, even in the absence of bison, will persist for up to decades, although they do eventually fill in and grow through. But what we're learning is that the species composition, even at a very micro level within that bison wallow, is very different than the surrounding prairie. They become little miniature wetlands on these otherwise dry grasslands, which are very, very important spawning grounds for amphibians and invertebrates. We just had a graduate student that's finishing up her work now that was working on the Prairie Reserve, who's finding that even the species composition for the grasses around the edge of these wallows is quite a bit different than just a couple feet past it. So you get kind of a halo effect where you have different vegetative diversity growing because it's kind of an edge habitat that's created by these bison wallows. So there's a number of things that are happening that just, we don't have a good substitute for these things in the absence of bison. All of which brings me back to the idea of an American Prairie Reserve, right? Like, why do this? At least as a wildlife ecologist, why go to the trouble of doing this? And the answer is, well, to put some of the toothpaste back in the tube, right? I mentioned that the grasslands are still mostly intact. We still have very kind of what we call upright prairie, untilled virgin prairie in a lot of places. The predominant land cover type in the region, right? It's being tilled up at a scary rate, and that depends on farm subsidies and prices in a given year, but it's still mostly intact. And so you have that kind of canvas upon which to paint back the indigenous wildlife that we know have all these very important effects that kind of trickle down to overall system biodiversity, particularly when you're talking about these ecosystem engineers like bison and beaver and prairie dogs. So now I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk to you about how we do this. Like how do you actually kind of how does American Prairie Reserve work as a land model, right? Like, because this isn't a national park. This isn't a federal park. It's not a national wildlife refuge. This is a private park in the sense that it's being built completely with private philanthropic dollars, but that is very much managed for the benefit of not only the wildlife, but people as well. So American Prairie Reserve is today, has always been, and will continue to be open to the general public. We're creating a kind of a public park with private money. And so let me talk about a little bit about how we do that. So this is the region again, just kind of a snapshot of the region in Montana that we're working. And before I zoom in, you can see there in that box, you've got kind of a light green area. That's the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument, designated fairly recently during the Clinton administration, right at the end of the Clinton administration. This is essentially Bureau of Land Management land, although it has some extra protections that aren't granted to typical Bureau of Land Management lands. Namely, they're protected against new oil and gas development. But other than that, they look and act pretty similar to typical BLM lands, which means you'd see a lot of cattle grazing on these public lands in the summertime. The other patch that you see there in the dark green is the Charlie Russell National Wildlife Refuge that I mentioned. Again, named after the artist that provided us with that painting that I'm constantly referring back to, When the Land Belonged to God. This is a 1.1 million acre wildlife refuge designated in the 30s, basically when they flooded the Missouri River there with the Fort Peck Dam, which you can kind of imagine in this picture. The surrounding lands were bought up by the kind of, or the federal agencies had different names back then, but essentially bought up, and so they could remove, there was a lot of settlement down on the river, so they could remove people so that they could flood the river, create the reservoir, and then the land that didn't flood was designated as the wildlife refuge, particularly for pronghorn and sage-grouse. But this has been in existence since the 30s. And it's actually the largest national wildlife refuge in the continental United States, so outside of Alaska. So let me zoom in a little bit more so you can see this a little bit better. This is just a satellite image of the region with none of the boundaries drawn in. I'll start to fill this map in for you. You can see there on the right side, the Missouri River cuts that almost flat line from left to right across the image. You can see that turn into a reservoir towards the right side of the picture. That's not the entire Fort Peck Reservoir. The dam is actually a little bit just to the right of the screen where it's cut off. And one thing you'll notice, particularly if you contrast the kind of center of the image with the northern part of the image there, you can see that the land remains very undeveloped. Up in that northern part of the picture there, that's the Milk River that you can kind of see, the Milk River corridor, you can just see cutting through the image. You can see it's very, very patchworky and developed. Now there's a town there, the town of Malta, Montana is there, but also a lot of that is farm ground because it's near enough to the Milk River to irrigate. But you see in the center of the image, you don't see those little blocks, right? This habitat remains largely intact. So now let me move away from the satellite image just so we can see things a little clearer, get an idea for kind of what the human landscape looks like here. One thing you'll notice right away is we do have neighbors that neighboring Indian reservations right next door to American Prairie Reserve. Here you see the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, the Rocky Boy Reservation, and then just off the screen to the right is the Fort Peck Reservation as well. Not a lot of roads either, right? This is all of the paved roads in the region. I'm not kidding you. Like what you see here is every single paved road in this gigantic extent. This image is probably 100 miles east to west. Add into that the National Wildlife Refuge. Again, this is the Charlie Russell that we talked about. This already exists long before we get here. This is area set aside by the federal government as a wildlife refuge. Added that to the National Monument. I already talked about that. That's the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument that was designated in the 90s. Add on to that, all of the kind of sage green colored land that I've just added now is public lands in the region, or public lands kind of outside of the National Monument and the Wildlife Refuge, right? So that is predominantly Bureau of Land Management lands, public lands that are generally thought of as grazing lands, although they are managed for multiple use. Some, although a minority of that land is also state parcels as well, but it acts very similar to BLM land for our purposes. So this is the scene, right? This is what you have kind of right as American Prairie Reserve shows up. And the idea was, well, hey, we've got this giant anchor of the largest national wildlife refuge in the continental United States already existing. Is there a way that we can just make that bigger, right? Because the government has more or less lost its appetite for making large protected areas, right? The Grand Teton National Park was designated in the 50s, and that was really the last large national park that we see created. So the thought was, well, is there a way to expand upon this existing area, particularly because the area around the CMR is still so intact as far as prairie goes? And then you look at this and you say, well, even the area outside of the refuge is still mostly public land, right? Particularly mostly Bureau of Land Management land with a little bit of state land. So the preponderance of land out here is already public. So the thought is, what if we were to just acquire the deeded parcels in between? It's kind of the caulking between the mosaic tiles, if you will, so that we can stitch together a larger area for wildlife in the region. And that's exactly how we operate. So I mentioned that it's all philanthropic dollars. We take donor money and win these ranches, and all of this deeded, all of the white that you see is ranches, basically. There's no towns here. These are just homesteads, or you know, sometimes very, very large ranches, but it's a single family, a single operation existing on each of these parcels with access to the public land for their cattle. So when those ranches come up for sale, and generally when people talk about ranches out here, they're not just talking about their deeded land, the land that they own the title to, but also the grazing lands that kind of come with it, to which they have first right of refusal. Those are the public Bureau of Land Management lands on which they're grazing their cattle in the summer. Those ranches come up for sale all the time, and so we take private dollars through philanthropy and we buy those ranches when we can, and that's what you see on the map now in the kind of darkest green are all the private holdings that we as American Prairie Reserve own today. It's about 100,000 acres. You add on to that those grazing leases that I talked about, right? And the way this works is they don't belong to the rancher, they're public lands, but the grazing leases usually get transferred with the deed to the kind of anchor property or the home place where the kind of the ranch house and the barn would be, basically, right? And so essentially the way it works is we get first right of refusal. So when we buy a ranch property, we talk to the Bureau of Land Management. They say, hey, there was a grazing lease associated with this property. Do you want to keep it? And we say, absolutely. And what we can do, and I'll talk about this in a second, is rather than grazing cattle, we can graze bison instead, because bison are actually considered livestock in all of Montana outside of Yellowstone National Park. But this is American Prairie Reserve as it exists today. And this is how we stitch this land together, right? We buy private lands that kind of make up the glue between all of these public lands to make the CMR bigger in effect, and then work with all of these collaborating land agencies to try and turn it into some kind of wildlife refuge. I mentioned that we had about 100,000 acres of deeded land, those kind of, I don't know, lime green colored lands or whatever, the grazing leases. make up another about 320,000 acres. So today, as it stands, American Prairie Reserve deeded and leased adds up to about 420,000 acres. Add that to the 1.1 million acres of the Charlie Russell National Wildlife Refuge, and you're looking about 1.5 million acres set aside almost exclusively for the benefit of wildlife and not livestock. The National Monument doesn't get the same designation because, again, it's primarily livestock in there, but it is protected in a sense for wildlife habitat. There's cows there, but it's also protected from kind of exploratory drilling, that sort of thing. So that's American Prairie Reserve, and that's how we build it. And when we get to the end, I can answer more questions about this. The land model has kind of, there's like the elevator, there's like the 30-second way of explaining the land model, which is just to say when ranches come up for sale, we buy them with philanthropic dollars, and then we convert them from commodity production to biodiversity management. And then there's the kind of semester-long take on land management, because land in the West is very, very weird and works in kind of a strange way that particularly folks that have never lived out west or live closer to the coasts where there's not a lot of public lands don't typically understand. So if this didn't make sense, I'm more than happy to come back to this at the end and answer questions that you may have. But moving on, those lands, as I mentioned, right now, today, still remain largely empty of wildlife, but we do open them up to the public immediately as we acquire them. The public are welcome to enjoy the properties not however they see fit. We really encourage the kind of like foot non-motorized traffic, although you really need a car to see this land because it's big, it's very, very expansive. But we encourage people to get out and go hiking, biking, canoeing the Missouri River, et cetera, et cetera. We get bird watchers, all types of people, artists, painters, and then we actually open for hunting during the hunting season as well. It's not a complete open door policy. Every year, myself and others are negotiating with the state agency to figure out what and how much kind of hunting we're going to allow in a given season based around our goals to rewild the place. But we know that you can hunt successfully and grow wildlife populations at the same time. So the other thing that kind of sets American Prairie Reserve apart from a typical national park, let's say, is that hunting is allowed. Just it's pretty limited, but what we don't deny the public access to, certainly the public lands, but even the deeded lands in some cases to hunt during the season. But getting back to this idea of, well, how do you fill this place up with wildlife, right? For some species, this is the greater sage-grouse, right? A pretty charismatic, well, probably our most charismatic, most recognized bird species in the region, right? This galliform bird, big turkey like a thing. This is a species that's not doing well across its range, but is actually doing pretty well in American Prairie Reserve, and that's because most of the threats to this bird are development of new roads, oil and gas infrastructure in large parts of Wyoming. The bird's not doing very well because they're just due to habitat loss. So if you want to recover or keep the sage-grouse that you have, it's actually quite simple. The answer is just don't do anything. Again, climate change notwithstanding, if we can just leave the prairie intact for these guys, they'll do okay. And so rewilding in this sense is largely passive. It's just don't mess it up, right? This is Teddy Roosevelt at the Grand Canyon, like, you know, the ages have been to work on it, man can only mar it. Very simple from my perspective. Just don't mess it up. And that's what rewilding looks like. For other species, there's a little bit more hands-on work that you have to do. The pronghorn's a really good example of this, but it's still relatively simple. The habitat exists for this guy, even though his populations are artificially low, but it's mostly an issue. It's not overhunting by and large. They are severely impacted by periodically bad winters and bad winters that they can't get away from. This is the fastest land mammal in North America. It can run away from storms very well unless you have a landscape that's completely filled with thousands and thousands of miles of barbed wire fencing. This animal doesn't know how to jump because it evolved on the open prairie. They don't jump. So unlike deer and elk, which can, you know, relatively easily get over a fairly low 4-wire barbed wire fence, these can't. And so when it comes to pronghorn recovery, sometimes it's as simple as just either removing fences that aren't needed anymore, and there are thousands of miles of just derelict fence out there. Or in the case where the fences are needed, it's a needed fence, you can modify them very simply to make them more permeable to pronghorn. Basically, you just take that bottom wire 18 inches off the ground, and they go right underneath it. And so light touches make the world more hospitable for something like a pronghorn. Then you get more complicated species, right, that involve a lot of work. We talk a lot about social carrying capacity at the Prairie Reserve, which is the amount of wildlife people are willing to tolerate. Habitat-wise, we have everything a grizzly bear needs, a population of grizzly bears need to live happy, successful lives on the prairie. What we don't have is tolerance. People that live there have gotten very used to not living with grizzly bears in their backyard, and most would like to keep it that way, I would say. And so the work is much more difficult, and it's not work that's done in the field, it's work that's done in meeting rooms or today Zoom calls, working with local communities, local ranchers to figure out how do you increase the social carrying capacity for wildlife, because that's all you need for something like a grizzly bear, although it can be very, very difficult to move that needle just, a centimeter at a time. Certain species, we get lucky, we can actually reintroduce them. This is that swift fox that I talked about that is extirpated from the region kind of on accident almost, has been gone for 50 years, but just in 2020, our colleagues at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute were able to reintroduce this species on the nearby Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. And so there's only 27 running around right now. That's not a population, but every year for the next 4, they'll be releasing another 40 to 50 swift fox at Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. And we've already had a fox make it all the way out to APR, walk across it before heading back up towards the river. And so certain species you can actually do kind of real hands-on biology, the actual reintroduction work. This would never happen with something like a grizzly bear or a wolf, but with something as innocuous as a swift fox or a black-footed ferret for that matter, it looks a lot more doable. Again, when you have the permission from the state agency, we can't do these things alone. But sometimes it's doable. And then lastly, the bison again. We come back to the bison, and bison, just due to this weird quirk of law in Montana, aren't considered wildlife. They're considered livestock. And so in the case of bison, which we know are this extraordinarily important species, not just because they're our national mammal, not just they're because big and charismatic and everybody likes bison, but bison make the habitat suitable for so many other species. And for bison in Montana, at least, we can buy them, which you can't typically do in North America with any wildlife, right? Wildlife are managed as a public trust species. You can't own them. They're not a commodity that can be bought and sold. They belong as a public trust to everybody. Not bison in Montana. They're considered livestock, so we can buy them, and we can kind of ranch bison. This is what I was alluding to earlier on the map with this idea of we can change the use of those public lands. We don't own the public lands, but we own the grazing lease to them. And rather than grazing cattle, where and when we can and have permission from the BLM, we choose to graze bison instead. We don't think of them as livestock, although we do have to pay taxes on them to the Department of Livestock. We have to follow all the rules of another livestock producer. But within the constraints, we manage them as much like wildlife as we can. And so we don't have bison everywhere just yet. They're on all of the Sun Prairie property there on the bottom circle, and then those top left 2 circles, they just exist on the deeded lands for now until we get permission from the BLM. But starting with as few as 16 bison that were released to American Prairie Reserve in 2005, we now have a population of about 800 bison across 3 different properties, with the eventual goal being greater than 5,000 bison on over 3.2 million acres. I didn't mention this. This is very important. The intended goal for this side, the Prairie Reserve, is nowhere near complete. What we think we need is about 3.2 million contiguous acres. That's the minimum amount of space that you would need to have an enclosed, viable prairie ecosystem. And for those of you for whom 3.2 million acres doesn't mean anything, that's about 1.5 times the size of Yellowstone National Park, or about the size of the state of Connecticut. So this is an incredibly large amount of space, but this is what a prairie ecosystem needs to be intact. It's a land of space where all animals are built to migrate, move around, and you have large landscape forces like fire and drought and flooding that need to be able to continue to exist, and you've got to have a lot of land to do that. So we got a long way to go, but we're also got a lot more bison than we did 15 years ago when there was only 16 of them. And of course, just as a reminder, bison are doing a lot of the kind of rewilding work for us. I wouldn't call it passive rewilding, but it's this interesting thing where you pick these specific species that kind of punch above their weight in terms of ecosystem contribution. Again, like a bison, like a beaver, like a prairie dog, and you set them loose, and to the extent that you're allowed, you allow them to kind of be a wild animal again, and then just by virtue of being a wild animal, they start to make the landscape more and more hospitable to a larger diversity of wildlife, both in terms of just species richness, but also abundance as well. And that's, I think I'll leave it there. I just want to say, if you're interested in the project or learning more, We encourage anybody to get involved. I mentioned that it's based on philanthropic donations, and so if you have the capacity to and you're interested, we're always soliciting donations, big or small, everything from $1 up to $1 million. Every contribution helps. We also encourage everybody to visit the Prairie Reserve. I know it's a long way from North Carolina, and I know it's even farther now with COVID still going on, but someday, somehow, we do hope that you're able to come visit it, because I do strongly subscribe to the belief that you can't protect something that you don't love, and you can't really love something that you've never experienced. So please, please come see us someday. We would love to have you out there. There are some volunteer opportunities if you're out in the region, and then also just spreading the word. Just if you thought this was interesting, if you think it's a cool project, we got every kind of social media channel you can imagine. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell all your family that lives out in Montana or Idaho or Wyoming. It means a lot, and it does help us to get the job done. And that's my last slide. Or I've got some other ones that we can bring up with questions, but that's all I wanted to talk about. And so let me stop my screen share here. Is that the right button?
I just want to thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk, and I think we all learned so much here. And if anyone has any questions, you can raise the little hand symbol in the top right-hand corner of the screen, and you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask a question. Or you can also put it in the chat box, which looks like a little conversation blurb that's located in the top right-hand corner. But I can start us off. When I was hearing you speak about the swift foxes, and I know you covered a bit about that, but what are the goals, the number that you'd like to have total, and how soon do you think you're going to get there? I know you had mentioned that there are 27 currently in the wild. So what is the long-term outlook kind of look like for them?
Yeah, the original goal was about 40 to 50 a year for 5 years. So 200 to 250 animals released over time. Obviously, we hope that they will eventually begin breeding on their own, but that was identified, not by me, but by our collaborating scientists with Smithsonian, as the kind of minimum viable population to have like a strong introductory effort that would propagate from there on. So we'll see. We're doing very intense monitoring of the population right now, but we're intending to release between 200 and 250 over the 5 years. And that should, based on our projections and our estimates, that should be enough to kind of give them the momentum they need to become self-sustaining after that. But it's contingent on a whole lot of factors, but that's the goal.
Great, thank you. That was helpful. And just a quick follow-up. So where are the animals that are being re-released? Are they coming from a breeding program, or where are those specimens coming from? Yeah.
No, that's an excellent question. As far as I know, there is no captive breeding of swift fox anywhere that I'm aware of. If you remember that range map, there are parts of the country where they're doing just fine. They just don't exist in our region, and it seems to be there's barriers to, and they just have a hard time naturally migrating down from Canada, which is the nearest kind of population. So the animals that were reintroduced in 2020 all were wild caught in Wyoming, so not too far south from here. And then in 2021, we'll be capturing again in Wyoming, but also parts of Colorado as well, central Colorado, that have big, healthy populations of swift fox through collaborations with those state agencies and other partners.
Great, thank you. I just find that to be a very interesting animal. I think Chad may have a question.
Yes, some of the paintings that you had shown, there were, you see a wolf occasionally. Is there a plan to introduce any gray wolves in the preserve?
Not a plan to introduce, and likewise for the grizzly bear. So the story is very similar when it comes to the kind of rewilding. I mean, they're different animals, right? But in terms of rewilding strategy, it looks pretty much the same. There's no intention, and I would argue no palatability to do an actual reintroduction of either species or a facilitated migration, I guess you could call it, since they have home ranges not too far from the Prairie Reserve. We don't think we need to, though, either. We learned a lot from the reintroduction of wolves in the late 90s into Yellowstone, central Idaho, right? It was a success biologically, but man, it got a lot of people really, really up in arms. It's difficult. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have done it. Quite the opposite. I worked with wolves in the Tetons before I went to graduate school, and so this is kind of near and dear to my heart. But one of the lessons learned from those kind of hard reintroductions is it's just no matter how much planning or public meetings go into it, people get upset. And the nice thing about wolves and grizzly bears in Montana is every year we get more and more wolf incursion, particularly up in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I didn't talk about this in my talk, but we think a lot about connectivity between the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, so where glacier is, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and the Prairie Reserve ecosystem. So you have species connection between these large protected areas. And we see that wolves are, as far as we know, there's never been an established pack, right? There's never been resident animals or a resident pair that constitutes a pack, but lone dispersing animals have made it past and through American Prairie Reserve before eventually being shot elsewhere. And so we know that that animal is getting up there already. And we think kind of as long as regulations don't change much, that will continue to happen and eventually it'll stick. And the story is actually very similar for the grizzly bears. Just for whatever reason, they seem to be coming more from the west than the south. So you may have seen it in the news, but grizzly bears in Montana every year are moving farther and farther across the Front Range, off the Front Range of the Rockies, and farther east into the prairies of Montana. It makes the news every time they do because you're seeing giant animals in a wheat field. And so they get closer and closer every year. In the same way with wolves, we think that kind of once they hit their murder, and we do believe they will find good habitat, and we will do everything we can to keep them there at that point.
Great. We have a question from Monty.
Yeah, hi. First of all, this is just fascinating. I'm really enjoying your talk, so thank you for that. Way in the beginning of your talk, you showed 4 significant grasslands around the world that you said were worthy of preservation and restoration. And I noticed none of them were in Africa.
Yeah. Which
really kind of blows my mind, since the savanna is kind of like, a signature ecosystem in Africa. So why is Africa excluded from that?
2 reasons. The map doesn't include areas that are already protected. And when we talk about the kind of like 4.6% of grasslands, shrublands, savannas that are protected, they're almost all in Africa. And so there's big patches that are already preserved, thankfully. And then the other spots are, again, this is not, I always debate whether or not it's confusing, but the original map from the IUCN shows all of the grasslands across the world. And there's tons, right? Like sub-Saharan Africa is filled with them. Giant parts of Australia are considered grassland or shrubland. But many of them are fragmented or have habitat use in a way that makes it seem less feasible to do that kind of large ecosystem level conservation. That doesn't mean you can't have a 500-acre park in Africa that doesn't exist, that can be a viable home for a rhinoceros or a giraffe or whatever. But in terms of like migrating wildebeest herds, which would be kind of a close analog or similar analog to bison, right? They need massive amounts of protected space, and those are just few and far between. They're hard to come by. Most areas of even grassland that appear open don't exist on the kind of scales that we're talking about. Again, this is like stuff the size of Connecticut, gigantic stretches of land. And so many of the grasslands are just too fragmented, according to the IUCN anyways, for consideration of the kind of wholesale ecosystem preservation. But that doesn't mean that they can't be protected in smaller pieces.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
One more question I had. You mentioned increasing the social carrying capacity for the wildlife over there. And I'm wondering how you're relating to the public, and are the public being great about being on board with the project, or has that been a really big struggle as you were going along?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm being completely honest, I don't want to sugarcoat it. American Prairie Reserve has pretty stiff opposition in our immediate backyard. It's personal for the people that live there, but kind of if you take the more removed look, it looks like whenever this happens anywhere, there's kind of a not in my backyard phenomenon, right? And so we have very, very ardent supporters in Montana, throughout the country and across the globe, and our most vocal opposition far and away are our nearest neighbors. It's ironic, but the pattern is not uncommon either. and I don't want to gloss over it. We take it really seriously, because even though it'd be nice to just talk with folks like y'all, supporters, right? It's much easier to talk to people like that. To get the work done, you have to engage with the community. And that's the nicer way of doing this too. Nice isn't the right word, right? Like, I mean, nice is nice to have, but nice isn't necessary. It's the kind of beautiful model of conservation is an idea of community-based conservation. And it's a hard thing to talk about with people that are kind of predisposed not to like you because they think you're trying to make their entire way of life disappear. It's not true, but that is the sentiment. And so social caring capacity, what we talk about, Tara, when it's like when you know we're dealing with those communities. I didn't really get into this, but it was mentioned briefly in my intro. Thank you for that. I manage something called the Wild Sky program, which I didn't talk about at all in my talk. But that program is actually one of the primary ways that we engage with our ranching neighbors, and just by virtue of the land use out there, all of our neighbors are ranchers, right? And so one of the things that I do through the program with Wild Sky, I didn't invent it, but I took over the reins a couple of years ago. Is we pay financial incentives for wildlife tolerance, basically. We've got a whole series, like a menu item of kind of conservation practices that ranchers can follow. Many already do. These are things they're already doing because they care about the sanctity of the land. They want to make sure that they keep it in good shape for their kids and their grandkids. But nobody's paying them to do that, right? They pay for their cattle production, but they don't pay for keeping grasslands healthy and intact. They don't pay for not plowing up virgin prairie to turn it into farmland or whatever. And so wildlife pays them an incentive based on production for that. But then we also pay for things like pictures of wildlife. My technician and I will set up cameras on the ranches, and we'll say, you know, for every picture of a black bear that shows up, we'll pay you $300. No questions asked. Doesn't matter if it caused any trouble. You didn't, even if you never saw it. It just wandered through the creek bed or whatever. There's value to you providing that stewardship. But again, a typical rancher, even if they're doing this out of their goodness of their heart, nobody pays them to do it. And some that don't might just as well say, well, why would I tolerate something that could potentially be a problem when it brings no value to me? So we have this very kind of like capitalistic approach to wildlife in the sense of, so what if somebody actually paid for this, right? So one of the things that pay rent for animals is the way I like to describe it. That's just one of a number of ways that we kind of think of the social carrying capacity problem. But yeah, it's as simple as just saying, well, like if the public supports public wildlife on other people's private lands or your cattle ranch, then somebody should pay for it, right? If we all really value wildlife, why not pay for it? That's a short answer to it could be potentially much longer, but yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. There's a lot of stuff that we do to try and address this social carrying capacity thing.
That was really helpful. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think Chad has a question.
Yes. Speaking of paying for it, who are or what organizations are some of your major donors?
It's mostly people. We don't get a lot of grant money. We will periodically apply for grants. We have typically, originally, not on principle, but almost as a rule, we didn't apply for public funding, like public grant money. We have applied to at certain times, public like foundations and stuff for grants for specific things. We're building a visitor center right now in Lewistown, and so we've applied for some kind of like foundation money to get that going, you know, some boring things nobody wants to pay for, like putting an HVAC system into a giant building. It's not as sexy as, you know, reintroducing Swift Fox. But the vast majority of the money, Chad, just comes from public donors. Now, many of these people have very deep pockets and are extraordinarily generous with their money, but almost all of our money comes from individual giving. You know, occasionally there'll be somebody who has like a family foundation and they'll write the donation through that, but it's people for the most part, not organizations that are funding this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
We have a question from Monty.
I hadn't raised my hand. I don't. Or maybe it's still raised. So I didn't take it down. Sorry.
That's totally fine.
Sorry about that.
Nope, you are all good. Let's see. Do we have any more questions? I think you must have covered everything so well and thorough that we are all just blown away by the amount of information. I know I am. All right, if anyone doesn't have any more questions, we will say thank you so much to our wonderful speaker tonight. And I'll turn it over to Chad if you want to say any last thoughts.
Well, I just wanted to thank everyone that joined us. It was a fascinating presentation, and it sounds like a dream job to have too. So it's it's a great part of the country to be in, I believe. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you again for having me, everyone. I enjoyed this. I hope we got a lot of. I hope we see you in person someday. I don't know about y'all, but I'm pretty tired of Zoom meetings. I'd love to talk to you in person someday. So please come out and see us when it's safe to do so and you feel comfortable. But thank you again for having me. I did enjoy this. If you have any follow-up questions or things that you didn't think of right away, Tara and Chad have my contact information. I'm also not that hard to find on the internet. By all means, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to chat with you offline if that's your preference. But yeah, I can't say it enough. Thank you very much for having me. This was a treat.
Great, thank you.
Chad, I think we should plan this as a field trip for the chapter. Maybe next.
I'm
in. You buy the flights, and we'll all go in with you.
And maybe we'll wait a few months because I think you said that there's snow there currently, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. maybe June's a great time to come.
Perfect.
Really too.
All right,
Thank
so
you.
we're heading there in June. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks.
Bye. Have a good night, everyone.